Good evening. I would like to welcome you all to the program sponsored by the Allen Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life. I'm Professor Yael Zerubbabel, the director of the center, and it's wonderful to see so many people come this evening for this event. We are really excited and glad to have Professor Alter from the University of California at Berkeley with us this evening. And before I will introduce him, I just want to mention that we had a week ago another lecture about the Bible and the binding of Isaac in Hebrew literature. It's wonderful to have this program tonight. And our last program, a major public program, will be in April 22nd. This will be a forum on Israeli memory, dissension, and nostalgia. And then we will end with another lecture by Professor Gary Rensberg, again on biblical literature. So I have to say that this semester somehow, and in the April 22nd program, one of the topics will also deal with the Bible. So it seems somehow that this semester we are immersed in the arts of the Bible from different perspectives in different historical periods, and I will welcome you all to come to the next programs as well. Professor Robert Alter is Emeritus Professor of Hebrew and Contemporary Literature at the University of California, Berkeley, where he taught since 1967. He is the author of many books, more than 20 books, on topics that range from European and American novel to modern Hebrew literature and the literary aspect of the Bible. Just to give you a sense of the amazing breadth of his intellectual work, Professor Alter has published books on Fielding and Stendhal, on the novel as a self-conscious genre, and more recently, a book entitled Imagined Cities, Urban Experience and the Language of the Novel. He also wrote books on Jewish literature and Hebrew writers, including one of Kafka, Benjamin, and Sholem, a book on modern Hebrew literature, and the invention of Hebrew prose. But perhaps the most significant part of his scholarly endeavor and pioneering work is the study of the literary aspects of the Bible. Among his books in this area are The Art of Biblical Narrative and The World of Biblical Literature that he published quite a few years ago, and then two prize-winning volumes on the narrative and the biblical narrative and biblical poetry. And by the way, it's not only that I'm not mentioning all the books, I'm also doing some shortcuts in order to make the introduction not too lengthy. He has published several volumes of translation and commentary, including the David story, the Book of Psalms, and the Wisdom books, Job, Proverbs, and the Classics, which is really one of his recent books. This amazing project that, as I just heard over dinner, is going on, and we are soon to be blessed with another book of translation and commentary on the prophets, has culminated in award-winning translation of Genesis and the 5 books of Moses. And I brought this book with me for those of you who would like to see this beautiful edition of the 5 Books of Moses with Robert Alter's translation. Professor Alter's eminent achievements have been recognized in numerous awards and honors. He is the Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy for Jewish Research. Among the many honors he has received, he was most recently named the 2013 Haskins Prize Lecturer by the American Council of Learned Societies. He received Robert Kirsch award from the Los Angeles Times for lifetime contribution to American letters, and he got twice to be a Guggenheim Fellow, a senior fellow of the NEH, a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. He taught at Princeton School, and he was a fellow there, and so on and so on. So it's a great honor for us to bring him to Rutgers. Tomorrow we will have a faculty seminar that will be part of our Henry Schwartzman Endowed program for faculty seminars that is co-sponsored by the department, by the program of comparative literature, and we are very grateful to Ellen Diamond for this co-sponsorship. And now it's my great honor to invite Professor Alter to speak about the pleasures and perils of translating the Bible. Thank you.
I have to say it's a great pleasure for me to be here. That in all my wanderings back and forth across the United States, for some reason, I've never before been at Rutgers, and it's very nice to see all these friendly faces. Now, the pleasure. Okay, is that better? Yeah, sorry about that. The pleasures of translation will, I hope, emerge from the remarks I'm going to make. The perils, of course, are you can make mistakes, and often, as much as you try to get at a certain effect in the Hebrew, you can't quite do it, and you hate yourself for the terrible compromise you've made. And maybe I'll give you a couple examples of those on the way. Now, nobody would set out to translate any classical work unless he or she felt that there was something wrong with all the existing translations. And I have to say that I think there's something very wrong with the existing translations. Let me bracket the King James Version. The King James Version is a wonderful achievement of English style. Some of it is beautifully eloquent, although there are flat-footed moments as well. During the 400th anniversary year, I had occasion to look closely at the King James Version. And of course, the other couple of problems with the King James Version are that they did not understand biblical Hebrew in Christian Hebraist circles in the 17th century nearly as well as we understand it. So there are a lot of errors. Some of them are real howlers. The language, some of it's become quite archaic. That's not their fault. 400 years have passed. And some of the eloquence, I have to say, is really 17th century English eloquence, Jacobean eloquence, more proliferating syllables and words without the compactness of the Hebrew. But I don't want to linger on that. The problem with the various contemporary translations, most of them done in the second half of the 20th century by the sundry ecclesiastical and scholarly committees, is that those committees had two deficiencies. One was a deficient sense of English style, which was not true with the King James Committee. The second problem is a deficient perception of biblical style. That is, you learn many important things if you do a PhD in biblical studies at Johns Hopkins or Yale or Harvard, but you're not going to talk about literary style. And this is something that the translators simply don't perceive. So let me lay out quickly some of the things I think that a translator needs to look at. And I'll give a few minute examples as I go along, and then give you 3 or 4 more extended passages as illustrations from my own translation. The first is a matter of diction. The kind of language, the register of the language that you have in the Hebrew. And basically, I would say there are 3 levels of diction. There's the diction of the narrative prose, which is simple, almost homespun, and yet has a kind of timeless dignity. And if you choose something that doesn't belong to that range of diction, for example, the New Jewish Publication Society has Joseph distributing rations in Egypt, which is all wrong for Shever, right? It belongs to army lingo and not to the narrative prose of the Bible. So this is the first thing. The two other levels of diction are the dialogues. And if I have time, I'll try to illustrate with one dialogue where you have certain, even though by and large people in the dialogues in the Bible speak correct literary Hebrew, there are various intimations of something a little bit more colloquial. And I think a translator has to reach for that. And then there's the poetry, which is a completely different level of diction. It's a specialized poetic language. It's something biblical scholars know, but I don't see it reflected in the translations. It has a somewhat different grammar. It has certain archaic forms. It has specialized terms that appear only in poetry and never in prose. And you have to do something with that as well as a translator. Okay, then we have an interesting challenge for any translator. Biblical narrative works with conventionally limited vocabulary. I'm absolutely convinced of this, and there's one perfectly good piece of evidence, which is the lexicon of the poetry is much richer. For example, basically there's only one way to say light, that is light as contrasted to darkness in biblical narrative, and that's or. And then ma'or is the source of light. In the poetry, you have ziv, zohar, and nugohot, and so forth, words that would correspond to illumination, splendor, brilliance, effulgence. So obviously, the prose writers understood that when you write prose, you only use this limited vocabulary. But then they got a lot of mileage out of it. And one of the ways that they got mileage out of it was artful repetition, not synonymity, but repetition. And what I find in all the modern translations is that they say, well, we don't want to keep saying the same word over again. So we will translate this word in the first sentence one way, the second sentence another way, everything by context. Let me give you a tiny example. In the Akedah story, which you heard about last week from Yael Feldman, the story of the binding of Isaac, Abraham, the narrator says, "Vayomer Avraham el Na'arav," and Abraham said to his lads, that is Na'ar in the plural, I and the lad will go up and worship and come back to you. And he uses the same word, Na'ar. Now, every single translation represents the first word as servant, which is accurate, but it misses an important effect of the repetition in the Hebrew. That is, Abraham speaks to his Na'arim, to his lads who are his servants, and he says, let me and the lad go up. He uses the same word, na'ar. So you have this poignant echoing where first he's talking to men who are probably his slaves. And then he's using the same word na'ar as a term of affection for the son that he thinks he's going to have to sacrifice. And again, there are examples of this sort. Then there's a matter of rhythm. And here I'm going to, rhythm is obviously relevant to the poetry, and I hope I will have time for one example later on. But it's also crucial for the prose. I don't think there's any kind of artful prose in any language that isn't intrinsically rhythmic in one way. Imagine something like this. Imagine a diabolic editor gets hold of the manuscript of Moby Dick, and he says, "Oh, it's a pretty good book. It's a nice story, Pursuit of a Whale and all that. But I think I'm going to fix it up a little bit. Where Melville says the whale has no face, I will say the whale has no countenance, because that's a more dignified word." And on this diabolical editor would go, taking all those wonderful iambic cadences that make you think of Shakespeare and Milton and turning them into arrhythmic sentences that mean more or less the same thing. It would still be a pretty good story, but it wouldn't have the magic, the mesmerizing power of Moby Dick. And that's what I find happens with translations of the Bible, even to a large extent the King James Version, but certainly modern translations. And I'll give you a tiny example of how I kind of stumbled onto why this was so important for me. When I began translating Genesis, I came to the verse that describes the creation of the two heavenly luminaries, which in the Hebrew sounds something like this: V'et ha'ma'or hagadol lememshelet hayom, v'et ha'ma'or hakaton lememshelet halayla, v'et ha'kochavim. And I translated it without thinking, and the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. And then I stopped short and I said, why did I translate it that way? Why did I say dominion? Memshelet is a fancier way to say to rule over than limshol, using the infinitive. So I'm using a fancier word. But then I realized that something else was happening. That as I read the Hebrew, as I listened to the Hebrew, there was this wonderful cadence that gave you a sense of the harmonious completion of celestial creation, et ha'ma'or hagadol lememshelet hayom, and so on and so forth. I needed that cadence in the English, which in this case I was able to replicate entirely, in order to convey to English readers what I thought was the particular power of the Hebrew. So there is this important matter of rhythm, both in poetry and prose, and I will offer you in a few minutes a different sort of example of prose rhythm. Then there's a matter of syntax. Now, to begin with, biblical narrative prose is written in what scholars call parataxis. This has nothing to do with taxis. It's parallel structures of syntax. And Abraham arose early in the morning, and he took his two lads and his donkey, and the and construction. And I think this is very important for the literary effect of biblical narrative, and I think it should be reproduced in the English, and there are English writers who use this kind of syntactical structure. It isn't as alien to literary English as some scholarly committees who have translated the Bible think, for example, the greatest piece of extended lyric prose in the English language written in the last 100 years, I think, is Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end of James Joyce's Ulysses. And one of the most important words in those 50 pages is "and." Molly speaks in this kind of parallel syntax. The other thing that I find important about syntax, the way words are ordered, very simply, is that it's often used very expressively by the biblical writers. And that I think a modern translator has an obligation to try to emulate that expressiveness. One example, when Jacob's sons come back to him from their first trip down into Egypt, and they give him the great news that Simeon is being held hostage in Egypt, and that the man who rules over all of Egypt, who of course is Joseph, will not see them again unless they bring down Benjamin. He answers them, forgive me if I say this first in the Hebrew, but I'll explain it in a moment. He says, Oti shikaltem, Yosef enenu, v'Shimon enenu, v'et Binyamin tikahu, alai hayu kulana. In my translation, it's like this. Me you have bereaved. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and Benjamin you would take, on me is all the burden. Let me go to the beginning of that sentence. Me you have bereaved. Of course, this is not the normal word order in English. But also, let's keep in mind that the Bible does not have to read like the daily newspaper. This is a syntactical inversion, and we have lots of syntactical inversion in literary English, especially if you go back 3 or 4 generations. Why did I do it? Why did it seem important to me? In the Hebrew, it's not the normal way to say it in biblical Hebrew. The normal way to say you have bereaved me is shikaltuni. That is, you take the verb l'shakel, to bereave, and you put an accusative suffix that means me at the tail end of the verb. But the writer decided not to do that. Instead, he broke out the me, oti, in the Hebrew, and he put it at the beginning of the sentence. Oti shikaltem, me you have bereaved. Why do I think he did it? Because, in my view, old Jacob, after the disappearance of Joseph, becomes a kind of prima donna of paternal grief. He's always dramatizing his own suffering as a bereaved father. So he puts himself right smack at the beginning of the sentence. Me you have bereaved, oti shikaltem. And then he comes at the end, alai hayu kulana. On me is it all is, on me is all the burden. And there are many, many examples like that where if you loosen up a little and don't translate the Bible as though it were written yesterday, you can get these effects in English. Then there's the matter of precision in word choice, which I believe the biblical writers were extremely careful about. Now, this is what we call philology, right? The scientific investigation, especially of ancient languages. And I'm all for philology. In fact, it's become one of the great joys of my life. This is part of the pleasures of translation. But I have this sense that biblical scholars often do not do philology quite the way it should be done. Because if you're looking at a narrative text, you have to look at not only at the possible cognates in Ugaritic or Akkadian or whatever, but you also have to look at the narrative context in which a term appears. And I will give two examples. Well, I can't resist three examples. The first is the story of the rape of Tamar in 2 Samuel 13. For those who don't remember, Amnon becomes enamored or begins to lust after his half-sister Tamar, and on the advice of a friend, he pretends to be ill and asks their father to send Tamar to his inner chamber and prepare him this particular food called livivot, that we really don't, in modern Hebrew it's latkes, but it's not that, but it clearly is related to lev, which means heart. Well, the word that's used for food and for feeding is birya and lahavrot, which occur maybe half a dozen times in this story and hardly anywhere else, just a few places elsewhere. All the translations say food. And I said that can't be right, because in biblical Hebrew, if you want to say food, you say either ochel, food, or you say lechem, bread, which is the synecdoche for food. So I looked at all the examples in the concordance, and the birya is always a kind of food you give somebody who has been fasting or is somehow failing. Okay? And then I thought about the etymology of the word, and it surely is related to bari, which means sort of healthy but also fat in biblical Hebrew. And the opposite of bari is dal, which is poorly. So if someone is poorly, you give him birya to make him bari. So I said, I can't translate it. To get the nuance, I'm going to say nourishment. I resisted translating it as chicken soup because that would have been too specific. Okay, two more examples. Here's a famous crux in the Bible. This actually is from poetry rather than prose. In David's victory psalm, which appears at the end of 2 Samuel, and again with some minor variations as Psalm 18, there's one phrase that nobody has really understood, anotcha tarbeni. And what is anot? So because the variant in Psalm says anvatcha, your humility, some people translate it as your humility, other people say, well, it's related to the word anot, which means to answer, so it's your answering power makes me great or something like that. I thought about the context. So the context is a series of weapons. You know, you put a bronze bow in my hand and give me this weapon and that weapon. So what could anot be? And then I remembered in Exodus, when Moses comes down from the mountain in the golden calf episode, he hears Lo kol enot gvura v'lo kol enot chalusha ki im kol enot anochi shomea. I don't hear the shouting out of victory, and I don't hear, I guess that's a reasonable, or the shout of defeat, but I hear shouting. Of course, lanot does also mean to speak in a big voice, so maybe this word means battle cry. That is, along with the weapons that God gives David, or the speaker in this victory psalm, he gives him a battle cry which terrifies the enemy. Okay, I have to give you an example where I made a mistake, which I'm now correcting. There's a word that appears 2 times in the Bible. I'm going to go with the second time first, which is where I made the mistake. In 2 Samuel 3, in the civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul, the sprinter Asael, who is as fleet as one of the deers of the field, is pursuing Abner, the savvy old general of the house of Saul. And Saul says to him, "Turn to the right or the left and take one of the lads and take his chalitza." So what is a chalitza? Well, the translations that I looked at said tunic, belt, some item of apparel. And I think I translated it as tunic. But then when I was translating in draft the Samson story a number of months ago, that's the only other place that chalitza appears. It suddenly dawned on me that this is wrong. That is, first, look at the narrative context. What does an ancient warrior take when he kills an enemy? We know from reading Homer. He takes his armor. And then it dawned on me that chalitza probably is related to chalutz, which in biblical Hebrew means military vanguard. So people in the chalutz wear chalitzot. And Abner is telling him to take his armor. And that then made me realize what a brilliant thing is done in the Samson story, which is, you remember when he makes the wager with the 30 Philistines, he says, I will give you, if you solve my riddle, for each of the 30 of you, a chalifat, that's with a fe, a chalifat begadim, a change of garments. But when he is outraged to find that his wife has divulged the riddle, he storms down to Gaza and he kills 30 Philistines, and he doesn't bring back chalifot with an F sound, he brings back chalitzot with a tzadi. That is, instead of killing normal Philistines, he kills warriors, and he brings back their armor, which is much more valuable than simply a change. So he sort of ups the ante in order to defy the Philistines. You see why there's fun in this particular kind of detective game. Okay, just 2 more things about specific terms, and then I will go on to some extended examples. There's another phenomenon which I don't, as far as I can make out, has not been observed in biblical scholarship, which is, now, in biblical and modern Hebrew, you have something called the construct state, smichut, where you take 2 nouns and stick them together, and it's the x of y, when you put x, y together like that. So I hope you can follow that. So like or hayom, the light of day, right? And you don't have to say of. Well, there's this odd thing in biblical Hebrew where 2 synonyms are put together in this construct state. For example, in the Exodus story, choshech afela. That is, the first word means darkness, and the second word means darkness. Now, I started collecting these examples, and I think I have now 30 or 40 of them. Whenever 2 synonyms are bracketed together in this construct state, it's an intensifier. So choshech hafela means hyper darkness, the greatest, I think I translated it as utmost darkness. So here's another example from the Exodus story, the same phenomenon where all the translations, including the most up-to-date ones, get the Hebrew wrong, not just miss this nuance of intensification. God says to Moses, I'm going to appear to you ba'av ha'anan. And everybody translates it as, I will appear to you in the thick cloud. But av doesn't mean thick. Aveh, with a hey on it, means thick. Av means cloud, just the way that anan means cloud. So it's the cloud of cloud. But following this pattern of a construct state of synonyms, what you have is the utmost cloud. It's a kind of mythical cloud. You can't imagine a cloud that's cloudier than this cloud. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to say about word choice in the Bible is that it's often very bold. And translators, by and large, have not matched the boldness of the biblical writers. And I'll just offer one example. We all people who know Hebrew know that a very common verb, lahashlich, means to fling. And it's, for example, the word that's used when Pharaoh says, every male child that is born you shall fling into the Nile. El hayaor tashlichehu. In the story of the banishment of Hagar, when she thinks Ishmael is dying, she takes him and I'm not going to fill in the verb for a minute. She does something to him under one of the bushes. So the King James Version says thrusts him, which is okay, but it's not exactly right. The various modern translations, including the JPS, say something like lay him, put him, set him under one of the bushes. But what she really does is she flings him under one of the bushes, which is shocking, but on second thought, it's psychologically profound. That is, she's convinced that within a matter of hours, perhaps minutes, her only son is going to be dead. And in a paroxysm of maternal grief, she flings him under one of the bushes. So that is a bold move that the Hebrew writer made that I think a translator owes it to that writer to replicate in the English. Okay, let me take the rest of the time allotted to me to walk you through a few extended translations where I'll say a little bit about things that I wrestled with, a couple of things that I solved, a couple of things I didn't quite solve, because let me emphasize, anybody who translates a great work and thinks that he or she has it is suffering from serious delusions. You have to accept the fact that you're only going to approximate. The question is how good an approximation it is. So my first is, I haven't talked much about poetry yet, so I will begin with an example from poetry, Psalm 30, which is short enough for me to read in its entirety. I'll skip the superscription. I shall exalt you, Lord, for you drew me up and you gave no joy to my enemies. Lord my God, I cried to you and you healed me. Lord, you brought me up from Sheol, gave me life from those gone down to the pit. Hymn to the Lord, O his faithful, acclaim his holy name. But a moment in his wrath, life in his pleasure. At evening one beds down weeping, and in the morning glad song. As for me, I thought in my quiet days, never will I stumble. Lord, in your pleasure you made me stand mountain strong. When you hid your face, I was stricken. To you, O Lord, I call, and to the Master I plead. What profit in my blood, in my going down deathward? Will dust acclaim you? Will it tell your truth? Hear, Lord, and grant me grace. Lord, become helper to me. You have turned my dirge to a dance for me, undone my sackcloth and bound me with joy. Oh, let my heart hymn you and be not still, Lord my God. For all time I acclaim you. Now, I'll begin with what's a kind of compromise, not a great compromise at the beginning. The Hebrew begins with Adomimcha Adonai ki dilitani. Now the verb lidalot is an odd one. It's almost unexpected. It's clearly formed on the more common lidlot, which is to pull a bucket up out of a well. And I found that important in the Hebrew. Why? Because the standard metaphor for near death in the Psalms is drowning. So I was about to drown and you pulled me up, the way you pull a bucket up. And I couldn't quite get that in the English, so I said, you drew me up, which is not great, but that's an example of a translator's compromise. But now, what about rhythm? I like to go to a line in the middle. What profit in my blood am I going down deathward? Now, the Hebrew sounds like this. Ma betza bidami beriditi el shachat. Now, if you heard the cadence, my translation reproduces it. And there was a simple maneuver here. There's the King James Version almost has it, but it has, what profit is there in my blood? And the is there spoils the rhythm. And you don't need it. What profit in my blood? And then, now I couldn't get the strong alliteration of ma betza bidami with the B and the M sounds. So I compensated in the second half of the line where there is no alliteration in the Hebrew, and I stuck in an alliteration there in my going down deathward. But here at the end of the poem, I want to comment on this to show how important sound is for meaning, which it always is in literature, and especially, of course, in poetry. You have turned my dirge to a dance for me, undone my sackcloth, and bound me with joy. Now, the Hebrew is hafachta mispedi lemachol li. Okay, misped is some kind of speech of mourning or song of mourning, of course, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, and that's bracketed with machol, dance. Now, in reading the poem in the Hebrew, it struck me that it was really important for the poet to have both the word for mourning and the word for joy begin with the same letter, mem. Because so God can take one thing and flip the end of the word, and make it into its opposite. So misped becomes, that is mourning, becomes machol, dance. So I looked at that for a while, and then every once in a while this happens to you, and this is part of the pleasures of translation. I said, wait a minute, how about dirge? Dirge is a nice word for a song of mourning, and it alliterates perfectly with dance. So this was, unlike what I did at the beginning of this psalm, this seemed to be a successful choice. Now, for rhythm, I'd like to read the parable of the poor man's ewe, that is U-E-W-E, Kivsat Harash, from 2 Samuel 12. And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, and here's the parable. 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor. The rich man had sheep and cattle in great abundance, and the poor man had nothing save one little ewe that he had bought. And he nurtured her and raised her with him together with his sons. From his crust she would eat, from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie. And she was to him like a daughter. And a wayfarer came to the rich man, and it seemed a pity to him to take from his own sheep and cattle to prepare for the traveler who had come to him. And he took the poor man's ewe and prepared it for the man who had come to him. That's the whole parable. And you remember, David, outraged, says, this man is doomed to die. And then Nathan says, you are the man. It works very much like the play within the play in Hamlet. You remember, Hamlet says, the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. And here it's not a play, but a parable. Now, in the Hebrew, right away, on a level of vocabulary and rhythm, you know that you're in a different world. You're not in the same narrative world as the surrounding story, but you're in a parable. That is, there are certain words here, like the word for wayfarer, and actually the word for poor man, which are not normally used in narrative prose. And I couldn't do too much with that. I couldn't find an equivalent English set of terms. On the other, there's also a kind of sing-song rhythm that goes along with the parable. Shnei anashim hayu be'ir echad ashir v'echad rash. That's the way it sounds at the beginning in the Hebrew. And so 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich, the other poor. Sort of gets at that. And in the middle of the parable, this is something I know no reader of this translation will ever notice this. Now you will all notice it, because I'm about to tell you. But it gave me a private satisfaction when I was translating. That is, from his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie. In the Hebrew, that's mi pito tochal umikoso tishteh v'cheko tishkav. Now, you have these 3 words for food or bread, and bosom or lap and cup, which are chek, kos. I'm sorry, it's pat, kos, chek. And when I realized you could do this in English, but by saying crust, cup, lap, and get the same rhythm, it made me very happy, even if it didn't necessarily make my readers happy. But anyway, I hope this microscopic example gives you some sense of why I feel that rhythm is important for the whole experience, the emotional experience, and the meaning of the story. Now, let me do something else from the flood story. This has to do with diction, although rhythm is also important. I'm going to read a few verses from Genesis 7. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came, water over the earth. And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives came into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Of the clean, I think I'm going to skip down a couple of lines. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the well springs of the great deep burst, and the casements of the heavens were open. Now that's a line of poetry. It scans as two half lines of parallel meaning. And here I'll stop for a moment to say something about diction. The word for casements, that I translate as casements, clearly means windows. It's arubot. Rashi, in his commentary, says fenestra bela'avs. That is, in the foreign language, that is, in Old French, it's fenestra, which in modern French is fenêtre. And he's right, that's what it means. This word, with one exception, occurs only in poetic texts, but it does occur in Ugaritic, so it's probably a very old word in the biblical period, and a poetic diction. So I said you can't say windows because that's the normal way to say it. That is, you have chalonot, which appears maybe 40 times in the Bible, or 50 times. So I think, well, there's this old-fashioned word which you can find in Shakespeare, and you find it in Keats, casements, which also means windows. So I opted for that. But I want to go from the poetic diction to the prose diction. And the rain was over the earth 40 days and 40 nights. That very day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons, together with him, came into the ark. They, as well as beasts of each kind and cattle of each kind, and each kind of crawling thing that crawls upon the earth, and each kind of bird, each winged thing. They came to Noah into the ark, 2 by 2 of all flesh that has the breath of life within it. And those that came in, male and female of all flesh, they came, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. And the flood was 40 days over the earth, and the waters multiplied and bore the earth upward, and it rose above the earth. And the waters surged and multiplied and mightily over the earth, and the ark went on the surface of the water. Now, I'd like to begin with the flood was and the ark went. In the kind of literary language that we use, we wouldn't say that. And in fact, the modern translations don't say that, although the King James Version is quite good in this respect. They say something like the flood overwhelmed or pounded down, or the rains pounded down. The New JPS says the ark drifted on the face of the waters. Somehow assuming, but we don't know, that Noah's Ark was rudderless. In fact, the eloquence and the beauty of the Hebrew is precisely in its self-limiting diction, in the fact that the most simple words are used, that the flood was 40 days over the earth, and the ark went on the surface of the waters. Also multiplied seems a little strange, I know, but I didn't want to let go of that for the simple reason it's the same word that's used at the beginning of Genesis in multiply and be fruitful and fill the earth. And I think that there's in connection with what I said about the artful use of repetition, that there's a pointed irony that the same verb that was attached to human procreation at the beginning of Genesis is now attached to the destruction of all things. The waters multiplied. So I tried to stick with that. Okay, I will give you just 2 more examples and then cease and desist. First, dialogue. I do feel that I owe you an example from dialogue. So, in Genesis 20, let's see if I have... the story of Abraham and Abimelech. Now, you remember that Abimelech takes Sarah into his harem because Abraham announces that she's his sister. And then first we have a dialogue exchange between God and Abimelech. And God came to Abimelech in a night dream and said to him, "You are a dead man because of the woman you took, as she is another's wife." And that's very abrupt. And Hincha met. So I tried to get the immediacy of that by, "You're a dead man." So of course Abimelech is shocked. But Abimelech had not come near her. We learn at the end of the story why he hadn't come near her, because actually God had smitten him and all his house with a plague of impotence, I think. And he said, "My Lord, will you slay a nation even if innocent?" Now that sounds weird, right? Will you slay a nation even if innocent? But the Hebrew sounds weird. The Hebrew is Hagoy gam tzadik taharog. And why does the Hebrew sound weird? This story comes immediately after the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think that there's almost a kind of rebuke of God. He say, "Are you up to your old tricks again, destroying whole nations? Did you not say to me, 'She is my sister'? And she too said, 'He is my brother.'" And that's why the Hebrew is a sputter of indignation. V'hi gam hi amra. So you got to get the sputter in the English too, and not just translated as kind of normalized English. Now I'm going to skip to the next exchange, that is God reassures Abimelech, and then the next morning Abraham shows up. Abimelech rose early in the morning and called to all his servants, and he spoke these things in their hearing, and the men were terribly afraid. And Abimelech called to Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? And how have I offended you, that you should bring upon me and my kingdom so great an offense? Things that should not have been done, you have done to me." And Abimelech said to Abraham, I got to stop here. There's an odd, generally unrecognized convention of biblical narrative. I actually did not recognize it in the first edition of my book on biblical narrative. We all know there's a set way to introduce dialogue in the Bible. And X said to Y, and then he speaks, and Y answered and said, and then Y speaks. But you have many cases in which you have the following. And X said to Y, he speaks, and then a repetition of that formula for introducing speech. And X said to Y, and X speaks again. In almost every instance that I've found, and I think I've collected 50 or more, whenever you have that odd pattern, repetition of the formula for introducing direct speech, and the first speaker continues speaking, it's because the other guy is having a problem in responding. Either he's dumbfounded, or confused, or amazed, or embarrassed, and that's a cue to the audience. And I think we'll see this in a moment in Abraham's response. So Abimelech says the second time, "What did you imagine when you did this thing?" Which is just a kind of compact version of his first speech. And Abraham said, Abraham finally figures out what he's going to say. For I thought there's surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And in point of fact, she is my sister, my father's daughter, though not my mother's daughter, and she became my wife. Now, what I translate as in point of fact is omna, which I take as a kind of legalism. That is, Abraham is kind of splitting hairs and trying to find a technicality to explain, well, she's sort of my sister, but not exactly my sister. And then here's another little neat move in the dialogue, which I think shows you how lively, pointing in the direction of spoken speech, like the he, she said, that you have in the dialogue. That one of the biblical words for God is Elohim, and that it has a masculine plural ending, but it's a singular noun. Vayomer Elohim, that is, and God said, it's attached to a singular verb. When this noun is treated as a plural, it doesn't mean God. It means the gods. Or gods with a small g, as when Aaron says with the golden calf, Elu Elohecha Yisrael, these are your gods, O Israel. So what's going on here? Abraham is speaking to a pagan. So he doesn't want to complicate him with covenantal promises of the God of heaven and earth and so forth. So he says, when by the way, the Hebrew verb is in the plural. Vayihi kasher hituni Elohim. Those of you who know Hebrew will immediately catch the plural form. So he says, when the gods made me a wanderer, which is almost a way of saying, when it was my fate to become a wanderer, and he's speaking to a polytheist in his own lingo. So there's something kind of piquant about that. Okay, last example, and I will then leave some time for your questions. In Exodus, at the beginning of the Moses story, and it happened at that time, Exodus 2, that Moses grew up and went out to his brothers and saw their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man of his brothers. And he turned this way and that, and saw that there was no man about, and he struck down the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. And he went out the next day, and look, 2 Hebrew men were brawling. And he said to the one in the wrong, "Why should you strike your fellow?" And he said, "Who set you as a man, prince and judge over us? Is it to kill me that you mean, as you killed the Egyptian?" Now, I've done something that I think all the translations avoid. Because, you're taught in the 6th grade that you don't repeat yourself when you write. The Hebrew word ish, very simple word that means man, occurs maybe half a dozen times in 4 verses here. And I've reproduced each of those repetitions. And by the way, one way you can see that the writer is going out of his way to repeat it is in the phrase, "Who set you as a man, prince and judge over us?" That is, you don't need to say a man. That is, "Mi samcha ish sar v'shofet aleinu." You don't need the ish. You can just say, who made you a prince and judge, right? But it was important for the writer to say ish, man, because there's something haunting about the way that the word man is repeated. It leads us to ponder, what is a man? What is a Hebrew man who's one of Moses' brothers? What is an Egyptian man? What is a man who is set up as a prince and a judge? And in fact, when in the next few verses, when Moses flees and shows up in Midian, he's identified because of his clothing as an Ish Mitzri, an Egyptian man. Again, the word Ish occurs. And that too has a kind of double meaning. In one sense, he really is an Egyptian. In another sense, he isn't an Egyptian at all. And all that wonderful richness of ambiguity comes through by the simple repetition of one of the most basic words in the Hebrew language. So to conclude, there are, as you see, many challenges, and some of them are quite insuperable. You just cannot find a decent English equivalent. Sometimes there's an equivalent lurking somewhere in the treasure house of the English language, and you don't see it and it doesn't occur to you. And then sometimes you get lucky, as I think I did with dirge and dance, and you get it just right. And then there are other places where simply by remaining faithful to what is going on in the Hebrew, when the Hebrew says man, 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 you say man, 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 you can get the literary effects of the Hebrew, and that's what I continue to try to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll be able to take some questions. So what I would like to ask you is to come to the mic here. It's a very big hall, and otherwise people would not hear. And line up for the questions over there.
Hi, I'm going to take this. I'm really tall.
Yeah, why don't you take it?
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm a student here at Rutgers. I just want to thank you, first of all, for coming and speaking to us. It was a very great and informative talk. I have a question about translators who have agendas, perhaps theological agendas. So I grew up a Christian, and you were talking earlier about the Sodom and Gomorrah story.
Yeah.
So as you all know, in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, beforehand, Abraham is greeted by these three men, or these three angels,
right,
who appear to him and talk to him. He gets Sarah to prepare them food, and they go and look over the cliff at Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right.
And a lot of Christians interpret that as meaning the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit,
right,
that these are pre-incarnation examples. And a lot of times throughout the Bible, it seems Christians can, and Muslims too, can interpret certain words and certain passages to mean things that they don't really mean. So as a translator, I was just wondering, in looking at other translations, what's probably one of the, I don't want to say worst or most bold examples of that sort of trying to fit a square linguistic peg in a circular theological hole?
That's a very, very well stated question. I would say, let me put it this way. The religious world of the biblical writers is very concrete. I mean, it's, of course, in many books like Psalms, it's intensely spiritual, but it's a spirituality that manifests itself through the here and now. So a kind of central example is all the translations of Psalms, even most of the modern translations, are full of salvation. Right. Now, salvation is a big resonant term. And I kind of admire, although I will not use it in my translation, the term God of my salvation. It's really very grand. But actually, the Hebrew word Yeshua, not in post-biblical Hebrew, but in biblical Hebrew, does not mean salvation. It means getting out of a tight fix. Right, that's and in military context, it would mean victory. So, say the phrase "My hand will toshiali," will give me Yeshua, means my hand will make me triumph. I decided to eliminate salvation entirely, which won't go well in the Bible Belt. And I translated it as God of my rescue. And I used the verb rescue. So there is a lot of that, right?
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I wanted to ask you where you differ from kind of Buber-Rosenzweig style translations, and specifically maybe Fox's translation in English. It seems like there are a lot of affinities that you might have with that style of translation, and I'm very interested in how you differ from that style.
Okay, good. I admire Everett Fox for his desire, following Buber-Rosenzweig, to convey in English the Hebrewness of the Hebrew. But here's the problem, and here's why I really differ fundamentally. From all we can make out, the ancient Hebrew writers had perfect pitch in the idiomatic use of their own language. They didn't write weird Hebrew. They wrote really excellent Hebrew. So if you in your search for laying bare the Hebrew roots in the English, you translate good literary Hebrew into weird English, there's some kind of, in my view, fundamental misrepresentation of the original. And I'll give you two examples, okay? Fox translates the ordinary Hebrew word mizbeach, altar, as slaughter site. Now, he does this because you can see the Hebrew verbs lizboach, to slaughter, in that formation. Although I'm not sure that ancient speakers of Hebrew thought of slaughter every time they said mizbech, just as when we say altar, which comes from the Latin meaning elevated place, I don't think that we think of elevation every time. And in fact, there's mizbach hanechoshet, the copper altar, which is an altar for incense, in which it's not involved with slaughter at all. So to translate altar or mizbeach as slaughter site seemed to me just strange. Another example, slightly different, in Fox's translation of the Ten Commandments, he like me likes to reach for the Hebrew rhythms, but I don't know if he always does that successfully, but I probably don't always do it successfully either. But in Lotin Af, the nix on adultery one, he translates, you shall not adulter. Now, right, adulter happens not to be an English verb, whereas linof is a perfectly normal Hebrew verb. And he did it because he wanted to get the compactness, but you can't do that. So that's how I differ.
Thank you. Thank you.
I gave up the rhythm on this one. I said, I'm afraid there's no other way to say it in intelligible English other than to commit adultery. So I said it that way. You shall not commit. Yeah.
You alluded to this earlier. I wondered if you would talk about the pros and cons of translating the vava hipuch as and versus just as a grammatical particle.
Well, here's why I almost always translate it as and. I mean, it does have a grammatical function. That is, when it appears before a verb, which is I'll use a simple shorthand term, in the the prefix form into, it turns what looks like a future verb, to simplify, into a past verb. So that's its grammatical function. But it's not a silent letter. That is, it is part of the rhythm of the sentence, which, if you simply erase it in one way or another, you're spoiling the rhythm of the sentence. And also, it often tantalizingly connects two clauses in sequence in an ambiguous way. You don't know, is there a causal relationship between this? Is it temporal or what have you? So I hate to give that up. And I had a friend who was my teacher when I was very young, when I was adolescent, Moshe Greenberg, who was a very fine biblical scholar, who was involved in the Jewish Publication Society translation. And I sent him my Genesis. Moshe died about 2 years ago. I sent him my Genesis when it appeared, and he wrote back a very diplomatic letter, but I could see he really disliked the translation, seriously. And he said, I don't know why you use so many ugly phrases. I didn't think I was using ugly phrases. But then he said, you can't repeat "and" that way, because English doesn't tolerate the repetition of "and" the way biblical Hebrew does. And I think that that's a statement that came from somebody who was a brilliant, learned biblical scholar, but not knowing a great deal about English style, because this repetition of "and" appears in some very fine writers. I mean, I mentioned the case of Molly Bloom's soliloquy in Joyce's Ulysses before. Hemingway uses it all the time. Cormac McCarthy today uses it. So I think that it's justified to that it would sacrifice something just to ignore the vav, the "and."
Good evening. My name's Cantor Ted Prosnitz, and I'm wondering what influence, if any, the ta'amim had on your translation.
Okay, let me explain for the whole. The ta'amim are the cantillation markings, which guide anybody who chants the text, and they were created probably 6th to 9th century Tiberius, but by the Nakdanei Tveria, the grammarians of Tiberius. And they were also a way of parsing the syntax of the text and in some cases interpreting the text. And occasionally it's been a guide for me. Sometimes the interpretive move of the cantillation marking just punctuates something that's quite obvious. For example, famously in the Joseph story, when he's propositioned by Mrs. Potiphar, and he says, "Vayima'en," and he refused. And this is given the cantillation trope shalshelet, which goes up and down and up and down and up and down. So you really have to, that's a very emphatic refusal, right? It goes on and on. So that's sort of fun, but I didn't need it for guidance. Sometimes I found myself actually in disagreement with the way the syntax was parsed by the Tiberian ta'amim.
Thank you.
Hello. I have a very specific question about.
Okay, I like specifics.
Translate. I want to know what happened to Nabayot in Genesis 28, verse 9. Esau went to Ishmael, took to wife
Yeah.
in addition to the wives he had. And in the JPS translation, it says, Machalat, the daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, sister of Nebaioth. And in your translation, she's not there.
Oh, I must make a note. Probably my eye skipped over it.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
Let me tell you something where I become extremely sympathetic with ancient scribes. I've gone over an enormous amount of here. I do want to jot that down so that if I've skipped it, I can communicate to my publisher for subsequent.
I was hoping there was some really wonderful thing that, you know.
No, the thing is that when you go over a mass of material, I don't know if it's eye fatigue or something like that, but I found that in a number of instances, most of them corrected by readers, fortunately. It's good to have a lot of readers. I skipped a word. In fact, let me tell you that in Deuteronomy, of course, you again and again have the combined phrase Adonai Elohecha, the Lord your God. And I actually hired somebody who knew Hebrew to vet my draft. And he discovered that in half a dozen instances, I had left out the Lord part of the Lord your God. So there was something in my head that must have said, enough already. You know, you said God, you don't have to say the Lord also. So thank you for yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I wish I had a profound and brilliant explanation.
I thought maybe, you know, that she had been some hot babe that wanted to be put in later, and you had a manuscript that didn't have her.
Right.
With regard to the question about the seventh commandment, I can't resist telling the story of the small child who read it and said, what does it mean not to commit adultery? And the mother said, or the father said, well, you know, it's like adding water to wine. Do not adulterate. And it occurs to me as you say this, that this at least preserves the rhythm. But the question I wanted to ask is, I'm just fascinated by that phrase, I forget just how it goes in the Bible. Somebody speaking to God about man and said, you made him a little less than God, which is translated in the King James as a little less than the angels.
Right.
I've seen some tortured arguments that it really meant angels, that Elohim sometimes uses angels. Could you tell us what you thought about that?
Yeah. But I can't, many of you may know this, but on the question of committing adultery, I think it's 1636, although I may be off on the year, a printing of the King James Version appeared in which there were a few suspect places. One said, "Thou shalt commit adultery," and this evidently. This is labeled the Wicked Bible, and if you can get hold of a copy, it'll bring you in a few $1 million, because the church immediately had them all destroyed, and apparently some printer had a quarrel with his boss and decided to subvert the. Okay, this is from Psalm 8 that you're referring to. I don't think they're exactly angels. That is the Hebrew v'tachasrehu ma'at me Elohim. This Elohim probably doesn't mean God, but it may be an ellipsis for B'nai HaElohim, which are the members of the celestial entourage that surround God, that appear in various places in Psalms and of course in the framed story of the book of Job. So that's what I think they are.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Judy Stern. I'm a professor emerita of psychology here at Rutgers, so I have a different kind of question. And after you've been living with and struggling with the biblical writings for so long, I'd like to know your conception of the writers, or writer, probably writers. So, for example, do you think they were infallible in their intent at what they were getting at? Did they have some peer reviews?
Yeah.
And did they make a living from this job?
Okay.
And if so, who paid them? And
Okay,
if
that's a
not,
very
what was
good
their day
question.
job?
Yeah. Okay. As far as we can tell, they did not make a living from this job. Some of them, many scholars think a lot of them, may have been in members of priestly scribal schools, so that they probably got some kind of stipend that way. But one thing is clear, that unlike the Homeric bard, who got paid, not in money, of course, and they didn't have a monetary exchange, but got paid with meals and gifts of garments and so forth. And we know this because the bard is represented in the Odyssey, not in the Iliad. There was nothing like a professional entertainer writer in the Hebrew world. Of course, they were not infallible. That is, they could, like any writers, that they could slip, they could make wrong moves, and clearly they were impelled by religious motives. That is the aim of almost all these narratives is to make manifest God's purpose in history, the story of His covenanted people from the founders all the way to the Babylonian exile and beyond. But I also think that they were people, and I kind of assume they were all men, that they were, so I will say that, as I'm trying to be historically accurate rather than promoting a sexist agenda. So I think these were men who relished the act of writing, who got as much, for all their religious national seriousness, got as much pleasure in manipulating narrative and language as I don't know, Henry Fielding or Balzac or Henry James. And the reason why I say this is you see these moves which I think delighted audiences and were also had to be self-delighting, that they make again and again. I'll give you one example, which this is, alas, untranslatable because we don't have equivalent terms in English. There's a technique in biblical narrative where you have, it also occasionally appears in poetry, you have a little segment of the story which concludes with a prominently featured word, and then a new segment starts, and the same word appears in an entirely different sense. For example, in the story of Ehud, who's one of the judges who assassinates Eglon, the king of Moab, he takes this short sword and, through a subterfuge, thrusts it into the belly of this fat king, and then makes his escape. And the verb that's used for thrust is litkoa, in the conjugated form vayitka. Then, as soon as he makes his escape, he grabs a shofar, which is a battle horn, and he blasts on the battle horn same verb, vayitka. I suppose because the breath thrusts through the concavity of the horn, but it means something entirely different now. Now, my inference is that somebody who was having a good time with language, who had a mastery over language and enjoyed his mastery, was the person who was writing a story like this.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, one more question.
I'm Cheryl, I'm a Rutgers alum. I just wondered, what do you do when you come across something other than Hebrew, like Aramaic, and how do you translate that? And also, what are you using as source material? Are you using the Dead Sea Scrolls? What
was the second half of your question?
What are you translating from, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or what is your source material?
Oh, okay. The second question is easier. The point of departure is what's called the Masoretic text, which is the received text that's been in circulation for perhaps almost 1,500 years. The oldest complete versions of it from Aleppo around the year 1000. But there are many errors in the Masoretic text. So what you have to do is you use, every biblical scholar does, the Biblica Hebraica, which was published in the late 60s in Stuttgart, which has variants down below. And then you can get other variants from other sources. So sometimes a Dead Sea Scrolls reading will seem to be a better reading. Sometimes one of the ancient translations into Greek or Aramaic or Syriac or Latin will be evidently have been based on a Hebrew text that has a more convincing reading. So when it's really convincing, I will go with that rather than the Masoretic text. Now, the question about the presence of Aramaic. Well, it's hard to indicate that in translation. Like in Job, there are a lot of Aramaic loanwords in the poetry. Not in the frame story, because the Job poet has this very rich vocabulary, and I'm sure he was a speaker of Aramaic as well as Hebrew, so he reached in every direction in order to enrich his vocabulary. And I don't know what you can do with that. For example, there's a standard biblical word, also modern word, for famine, ra'av. And he uses at one point kafan, which is the Aramaic word for hunger. What can you do with that in English? So I was, that's one of those places where I was just nonplussed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.